Hi everyone, I'm Robin with IMGS and I wanted to run through how FME can handle null values. Just a couple of examples. So FME sees null values as unknowns. So where a data field has an attribute and it's not filled in and we don't know if that's intentional or not. So that's different to an empty string where we would know that the data is intentionally left blank there, that there is no value, and that's intentional. And that also differs again from our missing data values, where, for example, a data schema may be expecting an attribute, and then when the data is read in, it is missing. It's not in the source data. So what we have on screen here is just some test data coming out of an attribute manager here. We've got 5 records, and we can see in the location field, there's 2 records that are null. So we don't know if data is intentionally missing there or not. And then we have the notes field, which has 2 records that are left as empty strings. And that is where there just are no notes for those records, and that's the way it's supposed to be. And then we have our timestamp here, which is an attribute that was expected to come in the source data, but is missing. We don't have any values for that. And now FME can handle all of these 3 different data types in different ways inside in your attribute managers and in your test filter, for example, matcher and your null attribute value mapper, which I'll show in a couple of moments. So for example, if we look at our test filter here and we click in here, we're checking to see what values are empty, null, or missing on the notes, location, and timestamp fields. And if we click into this, we can do it's just conditional filtering, and we can expand out this operator window here. And these are all the ones that we typically expect, but down at the bottom, we have our attribute is null, attribute is empty string, or attribute is missing. So we can differentiate between the 3, which is very useful when you've different input data formats or data types. And we can also do the converse of this. If we didn't want to distinguish between the 3, we could say attribute has a value and we're filtering on attributes that have one value or another. So I'll put this back to where it was, and we can see the 3 different outputs from this conditional test filtering. So under empty, and again, FME will run from top down, so it'll carry out the first query first, and then of the remaining data, carry out the remaining queries. So the first was empty, and this is in our notes field where we had those 2 empty data strings. Then of the remaining data, we've identified the null that's left over, so that's in our location field. And then of the remaining data, again, we have the timestamp field where we'd missing records. So it's just one way to distinguish in your data to help you filter through your data workflow. And another transformer that I use quite a lot is the matcher. So that's to help identify duplicates, whether they are in the attributes or in the geometry or both. So in the matcher, what it is able to do, so you are able to choose to filter or match based on the attributes themselves or the geometry, or as I said, both. And what's good in here is under attribute comparisons, we have differentiate empty, missing, and null attributes. So the default here is no, and it won't differentiate between those in terms of identifying matches on certain fields. But if you set that to yes, and that's on looking at our notes field, if you had in the notes field attributes that were empty strings and attributes that were null, and all other data fields were the same and those 2 were the one that was different, it would see those as different and they wouldn't be a match. But when you have that set to no here, then it would ignore those and it would match those 2 data records as the same. And then we have our null attribute mapper here. So this is really powerful when you're converting from different data formats. So for example, if you're reading in from CSV, it doesn't support nulls. It would treat them as empty strings. So you'd be reading in empty strings into your canvas. Or equally, if you're writing out to CSV or if you're writing out to map info, for example, where the numeric null value is seen as -9999. And where empty or rather null text values are written out as empty strings. So if you're converting from one format to another, as a lot of databases handle nulls, you're converting from one to the other, you may need to treat your null values in a certain way in order to write out in the correct format. So the null attribute mapper allows you to do that in bulk on different attributes. So you can choose your attributes. In this case, I'd chosen timestamp, but you can choose all of these if you want to and treat them all the same way. But we'll keep timestamp for this video. And then you can choose if an attribute value is already identified as missing, null, or empty. You could choose all or none from this box. You also have the option if there's a certain value. So if it was minus 99999 coming in from a map info file and you want to turn it into null, you could type that in here, or you could also use a regular expression to do the same. And then you can choose what you want to map it out to. So do you want to map it out to an empty string if you're going out to CSV, or do you want to set it to null if it's going to a database, or you want to set it as missing? You can also set it as a new value. So again, if you were writing out to map info and you had a numeric field as null, you could set that to your minus 9999 here. So you could set that there. And yeah, so that's just a couple of the ways that FME is able to handle null, missing, and empty values.